going to be presenting for us today. One of our Steel Center ambassadors. We're David. I met on an orientation trip his first year. We went canoeing together.
We did,
and it was a good time. And he took my "What is Real" class, and always prepared and read, engaged with stuff, and generated conversations. So we're grateful he's part of the Steel Center, and I've heard good stuff about this talk. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Dr. Dow, for that amazing introduction. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to start it presenting my research and what I found, and then hopefully open up to discussion. And if I open for discussion and there's not much topic generation, then I'll just kind of continue presenting as well. So just kind of, it's up to you. But this is actually something I did as part of the Empire's Legacy professorship with Dr. Schwarzkopf. And we're supposed to choose something and I guess investigate colonialism and how it interacted with whatever we chose. And I chose African cultural products. And when I first started, I had no idea which cultural product I was going to do or like how I was going to investigate that impact. But as I did my research, I was able to narrow it down. And I guess I'll just get started with my presentation. So just to define some terminology, cultural products is very broad, but I made my own definition for this. I said there are items that were created in respect to a culture that reflected its views, ideology, or represents the culture itself in various mediums. These mediums include written or performed media like poetry, prose, and song. Visual mediums like sculptures, paintings, or dances, or even financial products that's related to what was traded, sold, or valued as a good. Again, it's very big and very broad. And when I first told Dr. Schwarzkopf I wanted to do this, I just kind of said cultural products, and me and him kind of agreed that we were going to narrow it down as a bit. Some of the things I had going into this project was, again, with cultural products being such a broad definition, how can I narrow it down? And two, when I narrowed it down, which cultural products would be the most beneficial to investigate in terms of like the best products to demonstrate this change? Could it be visual products, financial products, or oral products? And then how can I reflect what I've learned in a way that's respectful to the items and contextualizes the full understanding of the products? Like, and this is something I'm going to revisit towards the end of my presentation. Investigating different items or different cultures or different periods of time and how we can be respectful to that. And it's important to like build a deep context and a deep understanding of like what's going on and like what happened at this time to fully appreciate and fully understand what's going on. So what I chose were these things called power figures, in English for Minkisi, and I'm going to just refer to them as Minkisi for the rest of the presentation, just because, again, I want to be respectful to the culture and the items that I presented. Minkisi is actually the plural form of this. It's really Nkisi for just one. So just like a single power figure would be Nkisi, and Nkisi would be plural. And it's from the Bantu language family. And Nkisi refers to spirit. And there are two different ways they use this like kind of spiritual definition. The first is just like the spirit of anyone. And the second is like an item that holds a spirit or contains a spirit as like a vessel. And that's going to be important in understanding like the power figures. And as it says up here, they're containers. The Minkisi themselves are containers for the spirits of loved ones or ancestors. And after containing the spirits of the ancestors and loved ones, they use like the spiritual energy of the ancestor inside Minkisi to manifest different concepts. And these usually are like abstract concepts that they want to see in fruition, like fertility in the family, or like power, as in like a general sense. And we'll talk about like how power changes over time. But so fertility, power, just like being one with nature, or sometimes they're just used as like a physical representation of family member. So just some important context for analyzing Minkisi. Like I said, it's going to be very important for us to like understand the full context and the full like history of what's going on, so that we can actually like investigate this accurately. So some starter stuff is that wood carving was very prominent in like Africa, especially among African men, and particularly in Nigeria. This was something that they practiced in community groups, and it wasn't necessarily like a trade like exclusively, but it was kind of like a communal skill that everyone did. And this was like a big part of the culture among men in African different cultures. It was a way of like representing themselves, but also it was like a trade that you could teach down to like your son or your brother or just like other men in whatever place you're in. So this was like a very like core aspect of the community with men. And while it was like majority of men, there are some women who did this, but this was like a mainly like men thing in terms of just being in that community. The wood carvers are like often used to explore nature and concepts of nature. And there are other things they use, like they use shells or they use animal horns, or sometimes they use like different ceramics that they make with like pottery, like brick and clay and things like that. But wood is one of those natural things that they use in their arts to not only embody nature, but to like physically represent it. It's going to be very important in terms of keys in the future. And nudity was something that was portrayed often in the Nkisi, like in early forms. And it's important for the context, but it's also important to like realize that like here in America, sometimes nudity is kind of like inherently sexual, but like this wasn't the case for people making Nkisi. So it's just kind of important to remember that and keep that in mind when like some of the images that come up. And this is just a carved chair from the Angola people, the Choka people of Angola in the 19th century. So some more context. This is kind of like Minkisi, but this is like a ancestral shrine, as they call it. All right, so this is like it's like the Minkisi, except for this is like a bigger board. This is a shrine you would put on like a fireplace, or you put on the grave of someone who's dead. And it's kind of important to them, and it's called Dwin Fubara, which is like the pronunciation of the, I want to say it's the Igbo language. That was the name they referred to it as, so I'm just going to use that one. And during my presentation, I guess I'll just do a little bit more explanation on Nkisi. So part of the discussion and part of just like what I'm going to focus on when I get a presentation back is just just like why the names are important and why these concepts that are being analyzed are important, and why it's like the main, I guess, takeaway, just to prime you guys, is that sometimes we're able to physically look at something, and this like physical manifestation represents something larger than just being a physical body. It represents abstract concepts, and I chose the Minkisi to, I guess, show how that changed for African cultural practice over time. And I feel like that is like a good stepping way to lead to a larger conversation about like when other things change. And I actually have let's see here, some pictures I want to pass out because it's on my presentation, but it's really small, I must say. So you guys should look at these. You can just start talking about it now. Back here. And so one of the first things you'll notice is that this, like, the Minkisi is brown, and that's because it's made out of wood. And this was important for the Minkisi because since they were fundamentally designed to take spiritual energy into for like spiritual, spirits to inhabit them, they have to be made of something natural. And wood, African cultures, was the bridge between like nature and man. It seems I'm in my presentation back. Let's see here. Let's see here. So like I was saying, wood is important for harnessing the spirit. And this is a key aspect of Minkisi that you guys should keep in mind as we talk about it. And this Dwin Fubara and Minkisi were considered the same as living relative. And I put that as an asterisk. When I make this comparison as like same as living relative, it's kind of important language that I want to talk about when we get to discussion. So just keep that in mind. So here are some of the properties of Minkisi in the early 19th century. The main origins were in Central Africa, the Luba people, Senegal, and Igbo of Nigeria. And like I said, Minkisi were traditionally made out of wood carving for natural properties, but also, just wood carving was the cultural and common practice among men. And they were kept in homes and altars of loved ones. So this would be something that you would frequently encounter when you walk into someone's house. You would just see like the Minkisi they have to represent like past family members who died, or like loved ones, or just anyone in the family. And like I said, this is the same as a living relative. So it would be like just like having them in the house again. This is what the Minkisi represented. So here are some Nkisi that I was going to analyze. I passed out the picture of this tall one for those who may be too far away to see like the important features I'm going to break down. So this first one, as I said, this is like a nudity that's represented in Nkisi. This is just a naked African man, and nudity, along with fertility, was also just like one with nature. I oneness with nature because I mean, when we're naked, we're like that's how we came naturally, and that's how they represented this concept with the Nkisi. And you can see that here, there's like this is like a Minkisi that represents like familial support and power and strength in the family, because there's a man at the bottom with a sword, and there's a naked woman who's also pregnant, and that's like also generates like the power, like manifestation of like familial power and also fertility for a woman in the family. And then you just see like various African animals and things like that, like horns at the top. And these are all the things that I'm gonna break down later. So this change over time, like I said, the Minkisi were like originally and fundamentally supposed to be composed of wood carving, because that's how they got their that's how they were able to inhabit the spiritual like power and the spiritual essence of loved ones, and that's also how they were able to manifest these concepts spiritually. And what they originally was, they now include stuff like paints and metal. And something that you'll notice about this paint is that the paint is white on faces of people, and that's to represent white people. And this is like a big fundamental change between what was originally represented with Minkisi and now. The pictures of the animals are, as you can tell, these are horses and like dogs, which are greyhounds. So we have a change in the people that are being depicted, and we have a change in the animals that are being predicted. And we also see rifles in the arms of some of the people. There's a rifle right here, and there's some on people riding horses. So we see rifles, dogs, horses. We see white men, and overall, we just see an absence in the depiction of Black people and a depiction of the Black family, which is kind of a core part of the Minkisi. And just once again, the addition of metal is something that's kind of important that we're going to dissect here. So here are some of the implications of the change with the different things that are being represented in the different aspects of metal. One, wood carving was a strong community in African communities. So when you start to change what the materials in Minkisi are being made of, you're kind of devaluing wood carving as like a trade or a skill. Just not even just from Minkisi, but across African art, wood carving was like a very prominent thing. So when they started to trade with Great Britain and started to adapt like metalwork and things like that into their artwork, it kind of slowly dwindled away the community that was built around wood carving. And I guess like just on a larger scale, that kind of just shrunk the level of bond, the level of community in like the men in African countries, because they didn't have like a core common practice that they all did to like unite themselves. The other thing is, like I said, the Minkisi are like physical representations of like what they want to manifest, and how they depict them is like how they view that concept. So if we analyze the change in depictions, we can analyze like the change in how things are, I guess, prioritized and how these abstract concepts are represented. So we change from African men and African women to white people, we see like a fundamental change in like how they view power in terms of a person, like taking down the importance of like I guess your own ancestry and holding up people who came in through colonialism. We see the horses and the greyhounds, which are native like African animals. So we see a change in what they associate with parts of their culture and the typical things you would see in nature. It's a shift from the animal horns to just the greyhounds and horses, and also the shift in weapons and how they represent power. First, they had the man with the sword at the bottom of the Minkisi, and now we have men on horses and rifles. And it's a kind of a subtle shift, but also a dangerous shift that this depiction is starting to look more like war in terms of how they represent power. And the manifested power is kind of, I guess, more focused on destruction rather than manifesting support and like strength for a family unit. And then again, something that's important is that Minkisi take in spiritual energy from the fact that they're made of like wooden things and natural things. So when you add metal, you're fundamentally changing Minkisi's ability to interact with spiritual essence and contain that. And not only does that change that on a spiritual level, that changes the identity itself of what Minkisi is. And that's very dangerous. And we're going to talk about that in the discussion. So we can see how this change is reflected in other African cultural products. Here are some ceremonial daggers. And I mean, I guess you're right, but in the 19th and early 20th century, they used ceremonial daggers. Sometimes these were for dances, sometimes they were for tributes, and sometimes they were just made for throwing or even just like artistic expression. Um, and this was like a pretty positive way of metalworking. I know that I said that when metal replaced the wood and then Kisi had changed it, it did, but also it introduced new ways of like interacting with metal and artistic expression. So you can kind of see the serpent and the scorpion right here, the scorpion and the serpent. And you can just kind of look at all the various designs. And these are things that are often like gifted to kings or even just kind of sometimes like passed down in the family. And these are very important artistically. And the shield on the left is a work shield, and it had a strap for these ceremonial daggers. So this would be part of like the overall dance or the tribute they would do. They would have these shields and they would have the swords, and there would be a special place in the shield for it, and they would just go through the ceremonies. But after they interacted with Great Britain and after colonialism kind of changed how they viewed, I guess, shields in combat, we started to see this more Eurocentric approach. It kind of looks like a Viking shield with leather and metal. And while you may look at that and think that this change kind of promotes, I guess, like better shield for combat, you're also losing out some of the artistic expression from the ceremonial daggers because now we don't have the holster anymore for daggers, and that again devalues the ceremonial daggers as an art and as a skill. So once again, something that was used not only for artistic expression but was a core part of African culture is being devalued by the interaction between Great Britain and Africa. And here's a 1847 was made out of wood and metal. Now, AK-47s don't have any spiritual implications, I don't think, but I thought it was a good intersection between metal being introduced, like this type of metal and metalwork being introduced to Africa, and the practice of wood carving, because it's kind of like an intersection of like how wood was primarily used to display power and how metal is starting to augment that power. And we see that combined into AK-47, which, in my opinion, kind of represents destructive capability as their power more than anything else. So it's just kind of like an integration that you can see of not only the abstract concepts, but like physical properties that are being intermingled between the African cultures and interactions between Great Britain under colonialism. And like I said in the beginning of my presentation, when I said that the Menkisi were the same as a living relative, that'd be some language that we get back to later. And now's that time. So a little bit of a, I guess, an experiment that I want you guys to do is to kind of think to yourselves for a minute and try to relate something that you have or could have in your life that is kind of like the Menkisi, something that you would keep on like a altar or a grave or something that you keep in your house that's very important to you and something that would kind of represent a living family member. So just take a couple moments to think about that. Like a thumbs up or something if you guys have like a general idea of some object you're envisioning. I know I did this when I first was in London and looking at the different Kisi and how they changed over time. I tried to imagine how I would feel. And in order to do that, I kind of tried to relate the experience that I had. And what I thought of was an urn. Is anyone else who thought about that? And I see some people. So I thought of an urn as like something that represented like a family member that you would keep in the house. And when I thought about the urn, I tried to imagine like what if I had a urn of like the remains of my family members and they were taken to like the British Museum and like just kept behind glass for educational purposes. But when I thought about this, I realized that I kind of had a skewed mindset, which I called a colonial mindset, because one of the main things about colonialism is that when they try to relate to something, which usually they don't, but when they try to apply concepts of what they know rather than the concepts of like what's important to the people they're interacting with. And just a couple things that are like core differences between the urn and the Menkisi are the fact that while urns do, I guess to some extent, physically represent a family member, usually they're not really considered to be alive, or they're not really considered to be the same as the person was still alive. Is more for sentimental value, and they don't really usually have like religious connotations to them, while the Menkisi did. So when you like relate your experience to Ernst, like that, you're like reducing the religious value that the Menkisi had for African cultures, but you're also losing like the emotional severity of like the implications of this. This would be the same as, like I said, a living relative being behind glass at a museum for educational purposes. But even living relative is kind of like a little bit language, because it kind of implies, I guess, for us that there are certain qualities that someone has to have to be alive, or at least the qualities that we have in our culture, and that's usually, just like breathing and walking around rather than being a Minkisi or represented through wood carving. But for the African cultures, the Minkisi were exactly the same. There was no difference between them. So trying to, like, I guess, extrapolate the same as the living relative kind of reduces the fact that the African people didn't view it as the same. They were exactly just as they were. These are like identical. So it's kind of important to remember that when we're looking at different cultures, like the sentimental and religious value and emotional value that we have sometimes can be lost when we try to relate our experiences. While I do think it's important to relate our experiences, we have to make sure that we're not going too far into what we understand, and we're meeting them on their level and understand like the historical implications and like the context of what it goes into, like their concepts of whatever we're investigating, and just going further with that. And just reflecting on the experience that I had, I was able to see just like through different cultural products, mainly the Nikisi, how the different physical representations of power and things like that can change over time and change your interaction, and how they can physically represent abstract concepts. And when we investigate those, we can investigate how how severe and on what levels did like colonialism change the way we think about things and the way we address certain things. And even me, when I try to relate that to Ern, I kind of had that colonial mindset. So it's kind of like a very deeply rooted thing and deeply embedded that I feel like it's something that we have to an extent unlearn. But also at the same time, it's just deeply present in the African communities. Like, and it fundamentally changed how they represent things. It changed the way they bond their communities. It changed the way they produce art. And overall, it was just a fundamental change. So I guess the final takeaway of just the colonialism aspect of that is when we're addressing different cultural products, we have to meet them on the level and understand the context and the history behind it so that we can like fully investigate and fully understand without any explicit or implicit bias against it, or without I guess like a filter of the colonial mindset. And that's all I have for my presentation portion of it. And I kind of want to move to discussion and to see what you guys are thinking, or any, I guess, comparisons and experiences you can make in your own life, or just like questions you have for me or things like that. So I guess we can open up.
David, I have it's a comment. I'm hoping it's not going to be an annoying comment. Alana Jefferson Tate, who is a scholar of African religions and African heritage religions, makes your point and adds that things like Minkisi are Minkisi because of the way they're used. Mm-hmm. They're not objects. Yes. And so it's not even just like seeing a family member behind flags. It's seeing something that's being depicted as not, it is not that thing because it's not being used. It's become an object in a museum. Mm-hmm. Which is just really, I think we think of art as like things we can enjoy and look at. It's like, no, this is actually the way you use it. The way you use it in rituals and what matters when we sit in Minkisi. Yeah, I think that's a very important point, especially considering like the spiritual properties they had and the spiritual significance they had to the people who made them and owned them. So when you have the changes, like the adding metal to the Minkisi, not only are you changing how they're designed, but you're changing Minkisi itself to the point where it can't operate as a function it used to. It loses all like spiritual, I don't say spiritual value, but that's kind of the extent I'm looking at. I mean, it can no longer like be used and have the spirits of loved ones or the deceased because of the fact that the composition has changed from wood to metal, and just the way they change I guess the way they're used to manifest power and different concepts like that.
I think it's kind of dangerous, and I think it's a shame because the Minkisi started as a very prominent portion of like spiritual significance to all the people and of like different African cultures, and now it's doesn't even exist. And the way that it does exist, just fundamentally, is like a change to its identity and a change to its ability to serve its purpose, which means that they don't exist.
Yeah, very related to that. Do you think language-wise we can even call it a Minkisi anymore?
I think it's a good question. And I'm a little torn on that. When I'm making this presentation, I thought of language was used, especially for the statue or the tall. It was kind of complex Minkisi of the horses and the rifles and the dogs. I was kind of far in between whether I was going to call it Minkisi or a sculpture or somewhere in between, because I think it doesn't serve the purpose of a Minkisi or supposed to. So it's technically not a Minkisi at the same time. I think it's a little bit important to call it Minkisi just so we can observe the change over time, and so that we can see just how kind of skewed the Minkisi have become from their original, I guess their original purpose. And I'm a little fearful that if we stop calling like these new things Minkisi, that they're just going to be like lost to time, and that they're going to be just like, I guess, like relics from the 19th century and things like that, which most people won't be able to recognize, because when you shift the language, people won't be able to make the distinction between Minkisi being wooden spiritual inhabitants and the change between colonialism, because they're just seeing them as two different objects rather than like something that's been affected over time. Yes.
So when people were changing their like material and the look of Minkisi, was that already a conscious doing, or was it kind of always viewed by like the colonial mindset as like already something that they were free to change things?
I think it was more of like an artistic thing. When they came in from Great Britain, they had no basis for understanding the spiritual significance that the Minkisi had. And since part of the Minkisi's significance comes from like the root of the word, the Kisi of the spirit, for them not understanding that language, I feel like that's an important part of context that's lost in them. And I'm sure they saw the Minkisi and just thought of them as sculptures, and that's why they started to adopt the change the Minkisi to adopt features of what they thought sculptures were, or like how they represented sculptures. And that's why you see the depictions of white people, the depictions of the rifles, like the addition of metalwork, because that's how they sculpted in Great Britain. So it's kind of just like a change that even if they saw as just like an artistic change, became a fundamental change to the identity of Minkisi, and just like a fundamental change to how Minkisi could be spiritually significant to the people who made them.
I also had thought a little bit about that, kind of like the context of medium in these products and relevance to kind of like the natural world and things too. So sometimes whenever I've read about woodworking or speak to people who do that, they often kind of view it as revealing something that's already within the wood, right? So kind of like a harmony with nature, like it exists there, or it could be many different things, and it's their process to reveal what's already present. Whereas with metalworking, I haven't spoken to any like metal workers, but they view that. I made some notes here. I feel it's more like kind of forcing shapes, and instead of like a harmony with nature, it's almost like a domination of those resources. Because I don't think it's a huge reach to say that iron is, I mean, it's minerals, it's from nature, right? There's stuff in there, but then it's like really intensely coerced to create something that does not really appear naturally in nature. I feel like that's much different than something like carbon. So your presentation made me think of those things. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, especially when you consider just like, I guess, my overall understanding of like physical representations of abstract concepts, and I feel like the difference between wood carving and like metalwork kind of perfectly displays that. Like as you said, the like force and domination over to kind of force it into what it was. And the wood Minkisi actually did for that purpose of just like revealing what was there. It was like a oneness and a harmony between like the living people and like the living, I guess, like the life of Earth, I guess. And it was like a happy medium in between those things. And that's why the spirits were able to inhabit the wood, because it was the perfect medium that just kind of represented nature itself. So I guess like part of the spiritual significance was the harmony of this nature and the fact that they were able to be continue their life as a part of nature and just the infinite like renewal cycle of nature versus something that's like wooden, well not wooden, but like iron that's just going to rest somewhere and something you have to force into shape. And you know, also you're seeing that like with iron, they had to paint over it to get the faces of white people. So it's like it's very deliberate and very you have to change iron from its raw form in order to depict what the post-colonialism Minkisi were trying to, rather than like the original Minkisi made out of carved wood. It was already brown, so it was able to perfectly, like, I guess, and capture and demonstrate the black body, and just, I guess, just natural concepts like that. So I think it's interesting, taking away the fact that it was natural at first, and that the people lived in harmony with the wood, and the spirits kind of was an infinite cycle, rather than trying to force yourself into a physical representation of power, which in turn kind of just deletes the identity of what the Minkisi originally was and prevents it from executing its purpose.
It's kind of interesting that I never really thought of it as a layer addition because, like, in Burma, Pluto, Ogun is the god of iron, the god of metalwork. And I never really thought about whether that might be a sort of later attribute.
And I think that there are like some metalwork that people did in different African cultures. So like especially with weapons, they made a lot of swords and stuff out of bronze and iron and things like that. What I would say though is just that the Minkisi themselves, I feel, are like in particular and focused on the wooden aspect of it, just for like a spiritual capacity to harness the spirit, rather than like the artistic ability or like the power or the structure of like iron. So I think while there were different products that use different materials, for Minkisi, it was kind of important to have the wooden framework. And when they started changing it from wood to iron, and eventually just making it completely out of iron, you just like change the fundamental ability of it to serve its purpose. So even I said, but even if it was like a little bit of iron or a little bit of metal, there was incorporated that I can see how that could be like an addition that people were making to the Minkisi, but I think an outright change in its composition and making it entirely out of iron just completely just gets rid of its ability to serve its purpose.
As you're describing like how we ought to appreciate Minkisi, I hear like a description of appreciating it on its own terms. And like as we appreciate it on its own terms, or like in the way that it is and embedded in culture or embedded in nature, there's like this construction of it as an artifact, right? As an object, or as a work of art that might pose a problem to doing that, to being responsible to it. But also hear you saying like appreciating it by way of making sure we don't impose colonial concepts on it, right? So not just art concepts, but like kitsch, you know, like I was thinking of an example of, you know, you get figurine from your grandparents, and then you invest in that, or like project into that this idea that grandma gave you that, right? Or, you know, I have like carvings my dad did of Navy person and fisherman. Those represent my grandpa, right? But that's not what it is, right? So there's this like deconstructing biases, like a negative critique that's important too. So I'm wondering, like, both are important in this, like appreciating on its own terms, positively engaging, right? But then also like negatively critiquing one's own biases. And how does that work? Is one more important than the other? And what do you think about that? Like in terms of critiquing where we can go wrong and appreciate it.
Well, I'd say like first way I address that is I think it's important for us to understand like what we think and why we think it. I think on a fundamental level, we learn empathy as like when we're kids. If we do something like we hit a kid on the playground, an adult says like, "Don't do that. What if someone hurt you?" And I guess like it's kind of embedded in empathy as like as we progress that we're supposed to relate our own personal experiences to like someone else. And when we do that, I feel like it does allow us to like, I guess, extrapolate what someone else may be feeling or what someone else uh, may need in certain situations because of like we're all human and we all kind of experience like in general the same thing. But I think there's a little bit of a shift when it comes to cultural products, and not just cultural products, but also cultural products from different periods of time, because then we kind of lose our ability to relate in terms of our experiences to theirs, because just by the nature of them being across the globe and across periods of time, they did things differently, they understood things differently the way we did. Um, so it's tough to be able to empathize, but also to be able to understand. What I would say is the most important thing is to understand things in the way they did. And while we were able to relate our experiences to that in terms of like getting an emotional grasp on them, I think to develop that emotional grasp that we have in relation to our own experiences, we have to fully understand what we're relating to. And to do that, we need to develop a deep historical context and a deep like context of the way people thought about things. And that's why I think the Mikisi were a good way to represent this because they were physical representations of the way people thought and the way people process different concepts of power and fertility and nature. So we were able to like get like an actual look and across time about how people process things, how people thought. And so I guess just understanding the historical significance and the context and understanding the thought process is the first step and the best step to being able to relate to our own experience in a way that's respectful in a way that like fully encapsulates the way that they were relating to various cultural products.
Do you know of any communities that have been able to preserve the original, or I forgot how to say it, Minkisi, or like have maybe reverted back to it?
I'm not sure how much I would say like, preservation. Like as the religion that was kind of like the main thing that people used made Minkisi for kind of that out with colonialism, and it kind of dwindled with like the transatlantic slave trade because that's when you start to see like a mass conversion to Christianity. So like not only was this like an interaction between like what was traded and like what was valued as like skillful work, but it was also like the religious aspect was kind of what kept it preserved. And when you kind of change the religious importance and like the foundation of the religion in those places, you kind of change what's important for them in terms of expressing their religious identity in their spiritual ways. So I'd say even if it is preserved, it's fundamentally different than how it used to be, especially because I think even me, like being able to go to the British Museum, I still feel like there's a level of like disconnection from like what it actually meant to the people, especially because the descriptions of what was in like in case were written by people who were just didn't have a full understanding of what was going on. The only way to get that full understanding was to like do further research and figure out like narratives of people who had Minkisi. So I guess I'd say that Minkisi as they were are gone. And Minkisi is like what they can be. I'm not sure. I don't know what that entails, but I think just like the death of Minkisi as they were kind of represents a big change in identity for a lot of African places.
In your research, you ran into like this and on a broader scale of like museum decolonizations. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, one of the first wood carvings that I saw in the British Museum was taken from Nigeria, and there was a big like information card explaining where it was acquired, who got it, and who gave it to the British Museum. And one of the sentences was that it was raided by the Anglo-Egyptian army, whatever, and they took it and they clarified. They said this was a common practice practiced by like people at war at that time, and they didn't. I guess trying to qualify the fact that they took this artifact, but it wasn't necessarily wrong because other people did it. And I feel like a lot of times when you go to museums, you kind of see similar language like that. Like there were large collections. Like the guy who founded the British Museum, I forgot his name, but a lot of the stuff that the British Museum has, he gifted from his private collection. But when you look deeper into like how he got his private collection, a lot of it comes from slavery, and a lot of it comes from like going to places and like raiding and taking, and then saying that they're just spoils of war. So I think when you look at museums and how to like decolonize the way we view them and how museums are as like a concept. First, there has to be a language shift in how they talk about how they like acquire the materials, and also I think there should be some things that are given back. For example, the bin and bronzes, very controversial because the British Museum was like, "Hey, you guys bin and bronzes, but if you guys want it back, just let us know." And they're like, "Yeah, I want it back." And they said, "Oh no, we're not giving it to you." So it's like it's kind of like, I don't know exactly what language I want to go for here, but I think accountability needs to be there. I think they need to be real about how they acquired the materials, and also I think they need to be real with themselves about like the communities and cultures that are still active who may like be in need of the materials back, or for like people who are like legitimately asking for it to be back and they're not like listening to those. I think the first step would be accountability and listening.
So I've been thinking about this. Actually, we talked a little bit about it last week too, right? Like the British Museum is pretty well known for this habit of saying like, well, we have it now. We're still looking at it. So we're not gonna give it back, right? There's a British comic named James Acaster who has a like 3-minute bit on this, which is very humorous. But I guess so if we try and take a generous perspective from like, you know, the museum, it's like, oh no, this is cultural exchange. We're trying to learn about others. But spoils of war isn't exchange, right? Like cultural exchange sounds nice, but exchange necessarily requires some sense of agency. And if you had centuries of, you know, a spree across the world, you just took stuff, right? That's kind of ignoring agency. And that's not even to kind of go into a deeper examination of cultural exchange and whether it's done in good faith or whether it's really an obligation or all sorts of other things that we could explore. So I agree with your statements. I think that the British Museum has tried to articulate it as exchange and education, but they're ignoring a lot of the prerequisites for anything that could be called exchange.
And there are two things I would say that I think is a very good point. One of the first things, well, I guess the first thing I'm going to address is like cultural exchange and whether or not like the implications of that, whether there's like a understanding of what's going on or like whether the trade is fair. And one of the things that I thought of was there was these wood carving in Nigeria. They used to make really big gates, and it would be in front of royalty. They're I guess I don't want to say castles, but it would be in front of their property. And the Great Britain came in and was like, "Hey, I want a gate just like that." And the king was being very generous and gave the gate that he had, and that was just like somewhere on display in the British Museum. And whatever he got in return, I want to say was like some guns, I guess, or sometimes shells and things like that. And I think Great Britain took advantage of that also. Just tying it back to Minkisi, one of the core aspects of it was like natural things like shells and animal horns. So Great Britain saw things like this and were able to take advantage of that, and they would essentially trade shells or things of like minimal monetary value for things that are very culturally significant to African communities. And they framed it as like a fair trade because they said, well, these are actually really important to African communities, but they knew the trade was in bad faith. And like anytime an African person or someone in that community tries to get in touch about getting their artifact back, they're always denied. And another thing was when I was in the British Museum, I saw placards, and it was supposed to be in like stead of some tile from ancient Greece, and it said this isn't available because it's actually on loan to a museum in Greece. And I was like, how does that work? How are we loaning like I guess the artifacts of a country to that country, and eventually we have to give it back to Britain. And I'm interesting. It's interesting how we've kind of put that priority on like I guess preserving it for education and knowledge, but also like depriving communities and cultures of having their artifacts. Yes.
I was gonna ask, so based on what you've said, you made it clear that it's important to look at the evolution of this product just to see, like, again, it's important that people are educated about it so they can see the history of how colonization changed it. But then at the same time, I think that it like being placed in a museum and just the nature of museums of people kind of like passively looking at lots of things perpetuates it being misused and misunderstood. And so I'm wondering if you like in an ideal world, how would gosh, I'm blanking. I don't know what Minsky. Or not Minkisi. How would the Minkisi be exhibited in a way that like is conducive of learning and respectful understanding?
I'm excited about that. It's a tough answer because while they do represent like spiritual significance to the people who make them, I thought one of the solutions in my head that I had was to make artistic representations of the Minkisi that weren't necessarily tied to the spiritual aspect of it. And I was even conflicted on that answer because it seems like we're kind of reducing Minkisi to just like something to be looking at. But at the same time, I feel like it would be much better to have, like a representation of it rather than, like the actual Minkisi that serves spiritual significance and spiritual purpose for the people who made them. Also, it's a little reductive, but pictures, I guess. I know for some of the Benin bronzes were on loan to other museums, so they just had like pictures to scale of the Benin bronzes, and they, in my opinion, serve the like same effect. Especially since you can't touch art museums, there's no like tactile advantage you get by having it physically present. So I think finding a way to have physical representations of like different artifacts and different products without them actually being there, I feel like is an important step. Now, which way to do that, whether it be pictures or like commissioning artists to make replicas, I'm not sure, but I think it'd be a good step to take is to start by replacing with like representations rather than the actual items.
Halo first.
I was just gonna say that reminds me, I can't remember which museum it was. I think it's the Arkansas Fine Arts Museum, but they have a lot of like, I don't want to say performance pieces, but it's like historical pieces that are kind of accompanied by like the historical context of it. So do you think maybe like more so a video or like art history of the Meninsky rather than like actual sculptures of it?
I think it's a good idea, especially when you think about what museums are supposed to do. Allegedly, museums are, I guess, designed around education and like the experience of different cultures. So I think if we shifted museums from like a passive experience of just looking at things to like very in-depth, like I guess like documentaries or short videos that people get to see and like immerse themselves in the context and sometimes like the people who are like I guess affected by this or the people whose culture is significant to. Like, I feel like having those sort of like informative videos or experiences would be a lot more educational than like just having the things there just to sit there. And I think it's kind of universally recognized that it's an evil, I guess, to have, and I say evil as if the way museums view it. It's an evil to have artifacts on display, but they see it as a necessary evil because the good that's being taken from that is the fact that people are being educated. But I think when people aren't being educated and that good isn't present, you can't justify the necessary evil since it's not getting any benefit. So I think the best step would to, I guess, do things that are in like progression to that good. And if there's a necessary evil, I guess that's a bridge to cross. But I think with like experiences like that and like a mix of like replicas or pictures and informative videos, I feel like you get much more informative education with a lot less like evil, and you won't have to sacrifice some of your like ethical values to get that education.
So would the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis be like a good example of this ideal or somewhat ideal?
I think so. And I'm thinking about when that's the one that preserved like Martin Luther King Jr.'s like whatever. I think yes, I think so because well, one, I feel like it's a lot easier for us to understand since it's a part of American history. And it's that it wasn't so like we're not so far removed from the fact of like how people thought or how people understood different concepts. And also just the fact that it was well documented. I think those videos that they have and clips and like sound bites of different civil rights people in their like their speeches, and having I know they had a replica of some of there's a bus from the freedom fighters, and they had a replication of some of the signs that they were using during the civil rights protests of the garbage collectors who were being paid unfairly and were being exposed to dangerous machinery that killed a lot of them. I think being able to look at that visual experience is something that was more beneficial and more like educational than just like having, I guess, like the exact artifacts from there. Because one, they could be withered, so you kind of lose some of the context. But two, the replicas, I feel like they give, I guess, some value for some artists to like, I guess, be able to explore their work in a way that's educational to people and that moves towards the good, but also just as an experience as a whole, being able to like visually look at things and hear things and watch videos about like how I guess just different aspects of the civil rights like movement was pretty important. So I do agree that it's a good example. And the only thing that I would add is I think it would be a little bit harder in terms of like, I guess, in investigating things from further back in time, since we don't have those we don't have audio clips of people talking about Minkisi like we do have audio clips of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. So it's a little bit more difficult to navigate, but I think that's a good reference point and a good starting point to start moving towards more ethical museums and a more educational and ethical exploration of ideas from the past.
I just wanted to say that, like, as you're kind of talking through these other examples, it just makes me think of, in general, we use models all the time, whether it's in education or in other museums and things like that, right? So, I mean, fossil records, right? A lot of the times those are cast models, right? Or it also reminded me of the time that I was visiting Salt Lake City and I went to the big temple. Forgetting Mormon, within the Mormon faith. Yeah. So, like, if you're not Mormon, you can't go into the church, but they have an incredibly detailed model because that's a very special space for them. Right? And it is still quite impressive. You learn a lot from using models. And so I think that this idea of having models would make sense, especially because of just how often we do it in so many contexts, whether it's out of respect or because it no longer exists, like dinosaurs or safety, right? Like, you know, looking at models of things that are dangerous or hazardous, like we do that in natural sciences all the time. I think I'm not a chemist, but you know.
It's interesting that you sort of did this, like thinking about how they change every time, because actually Minkisi are still there. People still make them. It's a spiritual container, so they might not look exactly like that. Spiritual containers can take a lot of different forms, and people see them all the time. So, like in Kenya, you can go around, and they're not called Minkisi in Kenya, but you can find them anywhere. So it's interesting to think about it as not like this is what it was in the past, as much as it's like here's how it's been used throughout history, which requires oral history and living people talking about their own products, which is a very different vibe, I think, than a placard that is written by probably someone like me, right? Like everyone would say that.
I think it'd be interesting to look at like the evolution over time, and, like, do it as a continuous stream rather than just like points where they changed. I guess the only pushback I give is that I think when we view it as like a continuity, sometimes we miss the subtle changes that are made, or like the changes that are made that are kind of important to the like, identity of whatever we're looking at. Like even stepping outside of Minkisi, just over time, things are always constantly developing and changing. Just for like a very general example, like the game of basketball started as just people throwing balls into like a picnic basket, and now it evolved into like a $1 billion sport. And like they are like two extremes on the end. And if we just view them as a continuous line, I feel like we kind of miss out on some of the contributions that were made to that thing. Basketball, like, we lose some contributions. And when it comes to like interactions with like, I guess like colonists, those interactions largely tend to be negative. So I think we lose some of that context and some of the important interactions that like we can see that when a colonist came to this place, this interaction changed, and now it's really developed like this, and this changed, and this. Now, like, I think there's a place to be had where we view it the whole evolution as well as like, the increments. I don't think we should be lost in just like looking at sections of time, but I do think that the approach of looking at sections of like periods of time is important to understand the changes and how the evolution ended up being what it is today.
Sorry, so I do think that work was really better in the sense of something like Kisi, but would that not also, is it okay so long as there's like education behind it, like somebody is able to, I don't know, read the context that we're talking about, but because somebody's able to like read a placard, I don't know, I just think about it like if you go to a foreign country, like, you know, you go to Mexico and they have a whole bunch of like artifacts that are replicas of what, you know, something that they might do or enjoy culturally, and the Americans just buy it just because they think it's cool, but there's no like background knowledge. I think it's, you know, it's a cool thing. So does that not also, I don't know, devalue the original or anything?
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I'm torn on like how, like what step we would take to in terms of like changing how we represent different artifacts in museums and how museums are as a whole. Because when you do start like especially with Minkisi, like the mass production of what used to be a spiritual figure, now you start, I guess, it's losing the importance of like what was the previous importance of like the process of making it, what it's made out of, and like the importance of the family, rather than just like a cool African statue to have. So I think there is some trouble there in terms of like mass producing it in a way that can make replicas, but also kind of, I guess it's like a caricature of what they really represent. It's kind of a tough line that I'm not entirely sure how to navigate, but I think thinking about it like that and having those types of conversations is a good way to figure out like what is necessary and like which line, like, how far is too far, I want to say. But I do think that, like I said, education is a good way to make sure that we don't just lose ourselves to consumption, because I feel like mass production, just like looking at it from the lens of colonialism, that's just kind of it leads to capitalism and overconsumption and the devaluing of goods on like the individual level. And it seems like a big leap, but when you look at how it changes over time and the evolution of like when something becomes mass produced, that's where it inevitably leads. So I feel like education, yeah, would be the best step. I think that's a good question. I guess the last little thing I'll say is, while I did focus on the Minkisi, there are some like, I guess like changes in identity that can be reflected across other cultures. Like, which is the Kenyan flag, and you can see this shield is kind of it's the same as the wicker work shields that I showed on the previous slide. So I'll go back to it actually. So you see these shields that they made out of wicker work was it important enough to Kenyans to kind of symbolizing the flag. So I think that's another thing that I'd say to be careful for when you look at how things change over time, because we can see visually through the flag what was important to them and like what was a core aspects of like Kenyan identity. And then you shift the design of the shield and you shift what like, I guess you kind of take away something that was kind of important to them. So I think it's very important to look at the historical significance, the personal significance, and the cultural significance, and like just see like how these concepts were replaced or removed over time, and eventually what impact or what effect it had on those people. That's all I had.